Welcome to Sonara's Deep Dive.
When most of us think about the history of Christianity, our minds immediately go to Europe. We picture Rome or maybe Constantinople.
Right, the great councils, the popes, the emperors, that's the story we're all taught.
Exactly. We trust these power struggles between Western and Eastern Europe, but that whole narrative, it leaves out this enormous, world-defining chapter that was being written across Africa.
It absolutely does. You're missing these powerful, incredibly sophisticated Christian empires that were operating completely outside the orbit of Rome or Byzantium.
And these weren't just like passive communities receiving doctrine from overseas.
Not at all. They were actively defining their faith. In many ways, they were using their theology as a tool for political independence, for geopolitical defiance against the big imperial centers.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. We want to unpack that hidden history. We're going to look at how this idea of an imperial orthodoxy even started with Constantine.
And then we'll see how local resistance, especially in North Africa, with groups like the Donatists, kind of created a blueprint for dissent.
Right. And all of that sets the stage for a massive theological rift that creates this whole other family of churches, the Oriental Orthodox.
Which ultimately leads us to the Ethiopian Empire, an autonomous, powerful Christian kingdom that really stands as a beacon of a self-defined, distinctly African orthodoxy. It's a dramatic story.
Okay, so let's start with that blueprint, this idea of an imperial faith. Because before the 4th century, the church and the Roman state were, to put it mildly, not friends.
Hostile is probably the better word. But then Constantine comes along, and you have the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, and that changes everything. It fundamentally fuses religious and political power.
It's a total revolution. I mean, the faith goes from being this persecuted minority sect to basically the official ideology of the Roman Empire.
It's a tectonic shift. Before 325, a bishop's highest authority might be a local synod or a respected colleague. After 325, the highest authority is often the emperor himself.
And the state isn't just protecting the church, it's getting involved in its very structure.
Deeply embedded. We're talking doctrine, clerical culture, the whole economy of the church.
And Constantine, he didn't even wait to be ordained or anything. He just jumps in.
He was a layman, but he called himself a bishop for those without a bishop. An episcopus externus.
That's an incredible title. It basically gave him the authority to call the most important theological meeting in history, Nicaea, without having any real religious standing himself.
And it set a very dangerous precedent. His successors immediately ran with it. His son, Constantius, styled himself Episcopus Episcoporum.
The Bishop of Bishops.
The Bishop of Bishops. This wasn't just a fancy title. It was a direct claim to ultimate authority over the entire church. He was essentially saying, I, the emperor, decide what is correct belief, and I have the army to back it up.
So how did he or any emperor actually enforce that? It has to be more than just calling a meeting, right? What was the mechanism of this imperial orthodoxy?
It was a two-pronged approach, really. You had legislation and you had patronage. So, on the one hand, correct belief orthodoxy was defined by imperial policy and then written into law. By the time of Justinian in the 6th century, imperial law is actively punishing anyone who isn't a Nicene Christian.
So if you're Jewish or Samaritan or an Arian Christian,
you're outside the law. You face real political and financial consequences. Your very livelihood as a cleric, a bishop, was tied directly to your doctrinal compliance with the emperor.
Because the emperor held the purse strings?
He held the purse strings and the political muscle. That's the patronage side of it. All the imperial gifts, the land grants, the tax exemptions, the big church building projects, all of that flowed directly to the bishops in the cities that towed the imperial line.
And that naturally entrenched certain power centers.
Of course. It's why Rome, and more importantly for this story, Constantinople, the new Rome, became so powerful. They were the arbiters of faith because that's where the emperor lived. That's where the money and the laws came from.
So the geography of faith was really just the geography of imperial power.
Precisely. That political ecclesiastical link is what formed Byzantine Orthodoxy. It created this powerful, centralized standard. If you're a bishop way out in Egypt or North Africa, your influence, your church's wealth, it's all being measured against your loyalty to the court in Constantinople.
The pressure to conform must have been immense.
It was. But, and this is the crucial point, it didn't work everywhere.
Right.
That whole pressure cooker system met immediate resistance on the fringes of the empire. And it's in those places, like North Africa and Ethiopia, far from the emperor's immediate gaze, where we see the first seeds of a fierce, independent Christianity taking root.
They just refused to accept that theology was something that could be dictated by imperial policy.
Exactly. And that refusal is what sets the stage for the entire history of African Christianity.
So that brings us to North Africa. It's fascinating because the resistance there wasn't just some abstract theological debate. It was messy, it was violent, and it went on for centuries.
Yes, African Christianity was just defined by these deep internal splits where you can't really separate the theology from the local politics or the cultural identity.
And the first huge example of that is the Donatist Schism, right? It kicks off right after Constantine's conversion, around 314 CE.
It does. And on the surface, it seems like a very technical, clerical dispute. During the last big persecution, some church leaders, the so-called traditors, had handed over sacred scriptures to the Romans to save their own skins.
Okay, so they compromised.
They compromised. And the Donatists argued that any sacrament, especially baptism, performed by one of these compromised clerics, was invalid. It was a question of spiritual purity and authentic leadership.
But that theological disagreement just explodes into something much bigger.
It absolutely metastasizes into a full-blown social and political uprising. The Donatists, named for their leader Donatus Magnus, became a movement that stood in direct opposition to the Romanized, Latin-speaking elite that ran the imperial church.
It sounds like identity politics, but from, 1,700 years ago.
That's a great way to put it. And you can see it in the cultural markers. A key one was language. The Donatists heavily used the native Punic language in their services.
Whereas the imperial church, the Catholic side, they would have been using Latin.
The language of the administration, of the ruling class. So by using Punic, the Donatists were signaling this deep connection to the local African context. It was a form of resistance against Roman cultural dominance, almost like a continuation of the old rivalry between Carthage and Rome.
So the Donatist church became a channel for all this historic resentment against a colonial power.
It really did. And you also had this urban-rural divide. The Catholic Church was strong in the Roman cities, but the Donatists had a huge support in the countryside, among the peasant class.
The Circumcellions.
The Circumcellions, exactly. And they were often militant. They were fighting for economic justice, sometimes violently, against Catholic landowners. So what started as a debate about purity became a military problem for the empire.
So the Donatists really established this long tradition of African descent. And that tradition is still very much alive a century later when a new group shows up.
The Vandals.
The Vandals.
When their king, Gaiseric, crosses into North Africa in 429 CE, the situation is already a tinderbox. And Gaiseric and his people, they were Arian Christians, specifically a branch called Homoian.
So theologically, they were at odds with the Nicene Orthodoxy of Rome?
Completely at odds. So their conquest meant a huge religious shakeup.
Now, the story we usually hear is that the Vandals were just brutal persecutors of the Nicene Catholics. But it's more complicated than that, isn't it?
It's much more complicated. Yes, there was persecution. Writers like Victor Evita made sure we heard all about it. But when you dig deeper, you see something fascinating. The Vandal rulers didn't just smash the old system. They engaged in imitatio imperi.
Imperial imitation. So they were theological enemies, but administrative copycat.
That's it, exactly. They saw that the Constantinian model, using the state to enforce religious unity, was the most effective way to rule. So they just adopted it.
How so? What does that look like on the ground?
Well, they used the same imperial policies. They systematically stripped Nicene bishops of their churches, their property, their vast estates, and they handed all of that wealth and infrastructure over to their own favored Arian bishops.
So they're just using Constantine's patronage system, but in reverse.
Perfectly put. They're using the tool of imperial orthodoxy, just swapping out the dogma. And they even held their own councils. The Carthage Council in 484 CE was deliberately modeled on an earlier Roman-sponsored council. The Vandals were basically saying, we're the new Rome now, and we use the Roman system to enforce our truth.
That's incredible. And through all this, Roman rule, Vandal rule, this undercurrent of local African resistance just keeps going.
It's incredibly persistent. Even after the Byzantines reconquer North Africa in the 6th century, the local churches are still pushing back, resisting imperial control.
And this leads to that famous confrontation with Pope Gregory the Great around 590. He's trying to get the African bishops in line with Rome, and they're just not having it.
Right. And Gregory, from his perspective in Rome, he can't understand it as just a claim to autonomy. He looks at this centuries-long history of conflict and labels their resistance resurgent Donatism.
It's a convenient label,
Oh.
a heresy he can use to discredit them.
Exactly. But what modern scholars argue, and what the sources suggest, is that this was simply the African church's traditional sense of autonomy reasserting itself.
Oh, it could be anti-imperial without being Donatist.
Precisely. It shows that by the 6th century, a deep, persistent tradition of independent African Christianity was firmly established. They had learned the hard way that they had to resist both imperial and papal power to maintain their own identity. And that tradition of dissent is the foundation for the fully independent Christian empire that arises further south.
Ethiopia.
That history of local independence really sets the stage perfectly for what becomes a global-level crisis in the 5th century. This isn't about baptism anymore. This is about the fundamental nature of Jesus Christ. The Christological rift. It tore the Christian empire apart between 400 and 500 CE, and frankly, the consequences are still with us today. The whole debate was about the relationship between Christ's humanity and his divinity.
And the imperial court, they're desperate for unity. They need one single answer to this question.
They do. So Emperor Marcian convenes the Council of Chalcedon in 451 CE to settle it once and for all.
And Chalcedon produces its famous definition. Christ is one person in two natures. This is known as the diaphysite position.
Diaphysite, meaning the human and divine natures are distinct, they're not mixed, but they're perfectly united in the one person of Christ. This became the official position of the Imperial Church.
The tradition that leads to both Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism.
Correct. But instead of unifying the empire, Chalcedon caused a permanent schism.
Because huge, powerful churches, especially in the East and South, just flat out rejected it. Why? What was so wrong with that definition to them?
The churches of Alexandria, Antioch, and Armenia, they saw the diaphysite formula as dangerously close to another heresy, Nestorianism.
Right, the idea that Christ was almost two separate people. A human person and a divine person, just sort of loosely connected.
Exactly. So for them, affirming two natures after the incarnation felt like it was splitting the unity of Christ. They feared it undermined the whole mystery of God becoming man.
So the imperial church, from Constantinople and Rome, starts calling them monophysites.
Which is a derogatory term. It implies they believed Christ had only one divine nature, which was another heresy.
And that's not what they believe?
Not at all. They consistently and vehemently reject that label. They define themselves as Miaphysis.
Meaning one united nature.
One united nature. Their position is that the human and divine are united into a single incarnate nature, without any confusion, without change, without separation. They fully affirm Christ's humanity, but they refuse to use language that even hints at a separation of the two natures after the union.
So when major centers like Alexandria and Antioch reject the emperor's official theology, what happens?
Chaos. The emperors try to force Chalcedonian patriarchs on these cities, and it leads to riots, civil unrest, bloodshed. Especially in Alexandria, the rejection of Chalcedon became a powerful expression of Egyptian national identity, a way to resist the imperial power structure in Constantinople.
It's the Donatist story all over again, but on a much larger scale.
And this permanent fracture creates the Oriental Orthodox Communion,
Which is a major global church today.
a huge and ancient branch of Christianity, 60, maybe 70 million members or more. And their defining characteristic is that they accept only the first 3 ecumenical councils, and they reject Chalcedon.
So who makes up this communion?
You have 6 main autocephalous or self-governing churches: the Coptic Orthodox Church of Alexandria, traditionally the leader; the Syriac Orthodox Church of Antioch; the Armenian Apostolic Church; the Malankara Church in India; and bringing us back to our main story.
The Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo churches.
Exactly. The split was permanent. It proved that even the full force of an empire couldn't overcome deeply held theological conviction, especially in cultures that had already learned the value of autonomy.
Which brings us to Ethiopia, the Aksumite Empire. And this is not just an independent church community. This is a massive, self-assertive Christian empire on the world stage.
A genuine power player. Chronologically, it's rising at the same time as the Roman imperial complex. And the Ethiopian ruler, the Negus, or King of Kings, he ruled a vast territory. Not just modern Ethiopia, but across the Red Sea in Himyar, which is now Yemen.
So they're deeply involved in the great power politics of the ancient world.
Very much so, especially in the rivalry with the Sasanian Persians, who were the other superpower in the region.
And this is where it gets so complex and fascinating. Ethiopia maintains a geopolitical alliance with the Byzantine Empire, even though they are on opposite sides of the bigger theological debate in the world.
It boils down to a simple truth. The enemy of my enemy is my friend.
And the common enemy was Persia.
The Sasanian Persians, who are often allied with various Jewish Arab groups in Yemen, this posed a direct threat to Christian communities there, and, just as importantly, to Ethiopian trade routes. That shared threat was more important than the dispute over Chalcedon.
The story of Emperor Justin and the Ethiopian Negus Caleb is just incredible. It shows how pragmatic these empires could be.
It's a remarkable moment. Around 525 CE, the Miaphysite Christians in a city called Najran in Yemen were being brutally persecuted by the local ruler.
Okay.
Now, Emperor Justin in Constantinople, he's a staunch Chalcedonian, but he can't afford to let his influence in the region collapse. So he reaches out and forms a direct military alliance with Caleb, the Miaphysite king of Aksum.
A Chalcedonian emperor and a Miaphysite king joining forces.
It's a geopolitical odd couple, for sure. Caleb launches this massive invasion across the Red Sea, deposes the persecuting ruler, and reestablishes Christian control over the region. It was a huge projection of Ethiopian power that neutralized Persian influence for decades.
And crucially, this was just a military pact.
Purely military and diplomatic. There is no evidence Justin ever said, "Okay, Caleb, I'll help you, but you have to accept Chalcedon." They agreed to disagree on theology in order to achieve a common political goal.
Meanwhile, Ethiopia's theological independence was about way more than just rejecting one council. It was rooted in their own unique national story.
Absolutely. Ethiopian Christianity has this incredibly strong Judaic heritage. It's not just a historical footnote, it's foundational. It's all laid out in their sacred text, the Kebra Nagast, the Glory of Kings.
Which traces the Ethiopian royal line all the way back to the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon.
Right, and this deep connection to an older Judaic tradition made them naturally very conservative in their theology.
Right.
They were deeply suspicious of what they saw as newfangled Roman or Byzantine innovations.
So for them, rejecting Chalcedon wasn't just a theological choice, it was a defense of their ancient tradition.
Precisely. They were firmly aligned with Alexandria and Miaphysitism. And their position wasn't just a passive non-acceptance, it was active defiance. Some of their traditions openly condemn Emperor Marcian, who called the council as a heretic.
Wow. And yet, even with this fierce defiance, we see Ethiopian rulers borrowing from the Constantinian playbook. Is that just flattery?
I don't think so. I think it's a very sophisticated assertion of equality. It's that imitatio imperii again, but in a different context.
Okay.
If the emperor in Constantinople claims to rule a great Christian empire, then Negus in Aksum is saying, so do I. You see it on their coins. An emperor named MHDYS in the early 450s starts putting Constantinian slogans on his currency.
Like, in this sign you will conquer.
In hoc signo vinces. He's adopting the language of Roman imperial triumph, but he's applying it to his own Ethiopic cross, the masqual. He's not submitting to Rome, he's claiming to be on the same level.
And key to maintaining this independence was the Abuna system. Now, for centuries, the head of their church, the Abuna, was actually a Coptic monk appointed from Alexandria in Egypt. How can you be autonomous if a foreign power is appointing your leader?
That's the fascinating paradox. It's a case of formal dependence masking practical, absolute independence.
How did that work?
So yes, the Abuna was consecrated in Egypt. That maintained their connection to the apostolic succession within the Miaphysite family. But once that Abuna arrived in Ethiopia, he was under the complete control of the Negus.
The emperor called the shots.
The emperor called all the shots. He determined the Abuna's political role, his legal powers, his every move. The Ethiopians used the Coptic connection to validate their theology on the world stage, while ensuring the actual flow of power remained entirely domestic. It was a brilliant system.
It really allowed them to build this organic, self-defined African orthodoxy, interacting with the rest of the world entirely on their own terms.
And nowhere is that self-definition more clear, more tangible than in the way they actually worship.
The liturgy. Once you move past the politics and the high-level theology, this is where you really see the unique character of Ethiopian Christianity.
It's the deepest expression of their identity. But to appreciate how different it is, it helps to quickly look at the standard Byzantine rite first.
Okay, the liturgy of the Eastern Orthodox world.
Right. It's basically a synthesis of a couple of older traditions, mainly from Jerusalem and Constantinople. Over time, these were blended together into a highly uniform system.
And in that system, you really only have two main Eucharistic prayers or liturgies.
Just two. The liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, which is shorter and used most days, and the longer liturgy of St. Basil the Great, which is reserved for about 10 major feast days a year.
And the whole theological vibe is one of imitation or mimesis.
Yes, the church building is meant to be a microcosm of the universe. The priest's actions mirror the life of Christ. It's all a very sensory, symbolic imitation of heavenly worship.
Okay, now let's turn to the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, the EOTC. They share the same core Miaphysite belief as the Coptic Church in Egypt, but their liturgy is just profoundly different.
The differences are immediate, and they are striking. And it all starts with the tablet.
The tablet. This is their term for the Ark of the Covenant.
It represents the Ark, specifically the stone tablets of the Ten Commandments. And it is the single most revered, most essential sacred object in their entire tradition.
There's that direct link to the Solomonic Judaic heritage right at the center of worship.
Right there. The EOTC believes the original Ark of the Covenant is in a church in Aksum. So in every single one of their churches, they use a tablet, which is a consecrated slab of wood or stone, as the centerpiece of the altar. It represents that original Ark.
And you literally cannot have a service without it.
No liturgy is canonically valid without the tablet. The Eucharistic bread and the chalice must be placed on it. The priest rests his hand on it during key prayers. It localizes the divine presence in a way that is totally unique to Ethiopia, tying every single Eucharist back to their foundational national story.
That alone makes them unique. But what really shows their liturgical richness is the number of anaphoras they use.
This is one of the most astonishing details. The anaphora is the main Eucharistic prayer of consecration. Now, the Coptic Church in Egypt, their mother church, officially recognizes only 3.
St. Basil, St. Gregory, and St. Cyril.
Right. The Ethiopian Church canonically permits and actively celebrates 14 distinct anaphoras.
14. That's incredible. What does that tell us?
It tells you that this was an intellectual and spiritual environment that valued diversity and local theological expression far more than the centralized, uniform model you see in Byzantium.
So they have this huge repertoire they can draw from.
A huge repertoire. They're used on different days according to their liturgical calendar, the Neoa, and this collection includes not just the famous ones like Basil, but others attributed to the apostles, to our Lord, to John the Evangelist. It points to a deep internal history of theological creativity.
Let's talk about who is actually in the sanctuary. The EOTC has very specific rules about the number of celebrants, which is also symbolic.
It's deeply symbolic. Unlike in the Coptic tradition, where you can have many priests and deacons celebrating together, the EOTC strictly regulates the number. It must be 5, 7, 12, or 24.
And each number has a meaning.
Each number is a piece of theological code. 5 for the 5 nails of the cross, 7 for the 7 sacraments, 12 for the apostles, 24 for the heavenly priests from the book of Revelation.
In practice, what's the most common?
5 is the most practical, 2 priests and 3 deacons. But this strict adherence to number means that every liturgy is also a kind of living tableau, a physical representation of a core belief.
And then we get to maybe the most significant difference, something that divides them even from their closest relatives in the Coptic Church. The bread.
The Eucharistic bread. This is a massive theological statement. The EOTC uses unleavened bread.
Okay, so no yeast. Why is that so important to their theology?
Because for them, yeast is a symbol of sin. So by using unleavened bread, they are symbolizing the sinless, fatherless birth of Christ and the absolute purity of the Virgin Mary. To use leavened bread would, in their view, contaminate the purity of the mystery.
Which is the complete opposite of the Byzantine and Coptic traditions.
The complete opposite. They both use leavened bread, which for them symbolizes the resurrection, the rising of the dough, or, in the Coptic view, the sin of the world that Christ took upon himself. This is a profound, self-defined sacramental practice based entirely on their own symbolic interpretation.
And finally, even the way they read the scriptures is unique. It's this choreographed ritual.
It's beautiful, and it reinforces the hierarchy of the texts. The readings from the epistles and the gospel are spread among the different celebrants, and each one faces a different direction, symbolizing the gospel spreading to the 4 corners of the world.
So who reads what, and where do they face?
The first deacon reads St. Paul facing west. The second deacon reads the other epistles facing north. The assistant priest reads the Acts of the Apostles facing south. And then for the climax, the main celebrant priest reads the gospel, and he reads it facing east.
East, toward the rising sun, symbolizing the return of Christ.
Exactly, which is different from the Coptic tradition, where a deacon usually reads the gospel. In Ethiopia, having the main celebrant do it elevates the role of the priest in proclaiming that most sacred text. It's yet another layer of unique, self-defined ritual complexity.
This whole deep dive has really recentered my map of ancient Christianity. We started by seeing how the Constantinian model created this standard of imperial faith, enforced by power and money.
But right away, we saw that model being challenged. In North Africa, movements like the Donatists created this tradition of fierce cultural and theological independence.
And that tradition of dissent really provided the ideological fuel for the massive global split at the Council of Chalcedon, which created the Oriental Orthodox Churches.
Which then led us to the most profound example of all, the Ethiopian Empire. A kingdom that was powerful enough to fight alongside the Byzantine Emperor as a geopolitical equal, while at the same time completely rejecting his theology.
Right, maintaining their own Miaphysite orthodoxy, rooted in that unique Judaic heritage. And the proof of their independence isn't just in their history, it's in the way they worship.
The intimate details, the absolute centrality of the tablet, the stunning literary richness of having 14 anaphoras, the deeply symbolic choice to use unleavened bread. It all points to a truly organic, self-defined Christian empire.
And the whole story just brings us back to this one maybe uncomfortable realization. So much of what we call orthodoxy has been defined by politics, by power, and by geography.
Inextricably linked. Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to think about. The filioque clause.
The filioque, this one Latin word, meaning "and the Son," is the formal theological issue that split the Eastern Orthodox and Catholic churches.
It's an addition to the original Nicene Creed. It changes the line about the Holy Spirit to say that he proceeds from the Father and the Son. The West, starting in Spain around 589 CE, began adding it to the Creed.
Mainly to fight Arianism by beefing up the divine status of the Son.
Correct. But the Eastern Orthodox Church has always, and continues to, fiercely reject this addition.
So why did this one word, this seemingly small phrase, become the great divider? More so than even the debate over leavened and unleavened bread we just talked about.
For two critical reasons. First, from the Orthodox perspective, it was added unilaterally by the West. It lacks the authority of a true ecumenical council, so it's an illegal alteration of the Creed.
Okay, it's a procedural argument.
It starts as one. But the deeper, more profound theological argument is that they believe it disrupts the monarchy of the Father in the Trinity. They argue that the Father is the sole source, the sole cause within the Godhead, saying the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son creates two sources, which confuses the distinct roles of the persons of the Trinity.
And this theological argument had horrific geopolitical consequences.
It did. It was one of the justifications used by the Western Crusaders when they brutally sacked the Christian city of Constantinople in 1204. They saw the Byzantines as schismatics, in part because of this very clause.
So it proves the point of our whole discussion. When geopolitical power, in this case, the rising power of the papacy, tries to override established conciliar authority in traditional theology,
it becomes a church-dividing issue that lasts for more than 1,000 years. The fight over the filioque shows, maybe more clearly than anything else, that theological truth and political enforcement are permanently intertwined, and that at the end of the day, history is so often shaped by who gets to edit the creed.
Thanks for tuning into Sonara's Deep Dive. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss any of our future episodes. I bring you fresh content every week. Thanks for listening.